So, I will be the first to admit that I'm not the biggest Zelda fan. Or at least I'm not the biggest fan of traditional Zelda. I admit Tears of the Kingdom was amazing. I really struggle with a lot of the most critically acclaimed games in the series, like Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past. Yet, I still made this video. A 30-minute video game pitch on my idea for a 2D Zelda game. I've also done a little bit of writing up for a potential pitch for a sequel to that 2D Zelda game I pitched. By the way, tell me if you want that. Tell me if you want to make me pitch a sequel to Shadow of Descent, because I really do want to. But why? Why would I want a new 2D Zelda game so much if Zelda isn't even really much of my thing, and if I don't even really like the legendary Link to the Past that much? Why does 2D Zelda even matter that much outside of remakes nowadays at all, if it's so similar in gameplay to the much grander 3D Zelda? Well, allow me to tell you. It's been stated in interviews that the direction they took for Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom will be the direction that Zelda games will be taking moving forward. Personally, I think a mix of the two formats will be better, but it seems this is what 3D Zelda games will be doing from here on out. Now, most people, myself included, love this format. But there are still many who absolutely hate this format and think that open-world Zelda should be tossed into the flames or sealed away beneath Hyrule Castle. Then there's many more people who do love this format, but would still prefer it if Zelda went back to the classic style after Tears of the Kingdom. Like I said, once again, I feel like they should find a good balance between the two styles and try and please both fans, but it's hard to say if that will happen. Then let's just think about how long these big modern open-world Zelda games take to make. Tears of the Kingdom took 6 years to develop, and considering how Nintendo's main hardware platform is going to have taken a big upgrade by the time they can make a new big 3D Zelda game, that means that any new Zelda games from now on will have to put in a lot more work visually in order to properly take advantage of the hardware. Meaning, 6-year development times are probably going to become the standard for big 3D Zelda games. That's a lot of time between games. How many more Zelda games are we even going to get before we get too old to play video games anymore, or even just straight up die? So, the 3D Zelda games are taking a direction that not everyone is on board with, and they're also taking a very long time to make. If only there were a way to fill in the time between 3D Zelda games, and a way to satisfy the people who prefer the older style of Zelda. Oh wait, there it is, it's 2D Zelda. You get a second studio to develop new 2D Zelda games that can come out every 3 to 4 years, and have those 2D Zelda games follow the traditional format of Zelda games instead of the open world style. Suddenly, all parties are at least somewhat satisfied, and we have more Zelda games. It's a win for all! Now, it is worth wondering why bother having this second studio develop 2D Zelda games instead of 3D ones that still follow the traditional Zelda style. For one, there's the whole thing with how 2D Zelda games are cheaper and quicker to develop, and how they're more accessible, and how it's easier to tell apart two different series in the same franchise. One of those series is 2D and one is 3D. But it's also more than that. Even if the 2D top-down style and the 3D style are much more similar than the 2D side-scroller style and the 3D style, there's still definitely differences when it comes to the design of 2D Zelda games compared to 3D ones. The 3D ones are bigger and more grand, while the 2D ones are a lot more tightly designed. There's a lot less fluff in 2D Zelda games, and a lot more pure gameplay. 3D Zelda has a bunch of its own stuff on 2D Zelda, sure, but the point is that they're different. They have their own unique pros and cons. Because of that, it's important to have both. Now here's where we get to me. Why do I want this out of Zelda so much, when I don't even really care for most of the Zelda games in the traditional style? And my answer to this is that just because I've struggled with traditional Zelda games in the past, doesn't mean that the fact that they were traditional Zelda games was the reason I struggled with them. You see, I cited Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time as critically acclaimed Zelda games that I struggled with. But why exactly did I struggle with them? I'd say with almost near certainty that has to do with when these games came out. Now, when someone says a game didn't age well, what do they mean exactly? Often, it means that the technical limitations of the game system that a game was on held it back tremendously. However, many times it can mean something else very different that has nothing to do with the power of the hardware that the game was on. It can also mean that the design philosophy the developers were following had yet to be refined by the decades of games that we have now, and therefore making these games that came out back then not very accessible in the modern day, now that we're used to games being far more user-friendly. Technologically speaking, Link to the Past holds up great, but there were plenty of times when that game was being quite brutal and not beginner-friendly at all. Also many times, it expected me to do something that I had pretty much absolutely no way of knowing I needed to do, or even knowing that it was something that I could do. This also applies to Ocarina of Time, although to a far lesser extent. The game has aged significantly better than Link to the Past. Now, someone who grew up with these games would be used to this, and heck, when these games came out, they were absolutely fucking mind-blowing that a video game could even be like this. But as someone who didn't grow on Zelda, especially not old Zelda, this isn't something that I can get into no matter how hard I've tried. And believe me, I have tried pretty damn hard to get into the Link to the Past. Since then though, 3D Zelda has gone strong with games like Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword, which I'm pretty sure have aged well. And if I was able to properly get into the meat and potatoes of those games, I'd bet that I'd love them. However, I can't. Because these games have an entirely different problem that other people don't mind, but I absolutely hate. The prologues, or as I like to call them, the mind-numbing tutorial slogs. If I want to play through Wind Waker, then before I can get to the main game, first I have to do stuff around Link's home island a bit before some pirate falls into the forest, then take a big fat sword lesson so I can only fight 3 enemies before watching my sister get kidnapped. Then I have to do a bit more stuff before boarding a pirate ship and being forced to do a janky jumping puzzle, and then after that I have to do a whole annoying stealth section, because reasons, before then having to find a sail for my boat, and only then do I finally get to set sail on the open seas and enjoy Wind Waker for what it actually is. Except once I finally get free of the prologue, I don't even get to explore the ocean for that long because I'm immediately hit in the face with the first dungeon. I'm not sure how long this prologue took most people, but it took me too much time to count. And from what I've heard, Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword are even worse with their prologue sections. This whole issue with the super long prologues and inaccessibility with the traditional 3D Zelda games is exactly why I prefer 2D Zelda. 2D Zelda is way more accessible, and it's way easier and quicker to jump into. Yet, there's not a lot of modern 2D Zelda games. As I've stated, I struggle with the older Zelda games due to their age, which cuts out a lot of the 2D Zelda game library. Then, out of the other 2D Zelda games, there's a Link's Awakening remake, which I actually really like, but it's still a one-to-one remake of one of the older Zelda games. And because of that, there's some parts of the game that were horrendously designed, to the point where even the Grandpa O'Reaver hint system can't save you. Cough! Trading sequence. Cough! There's Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, which I haven't played. I do want to play them, though I'm not all that confident since I've heard there's some of the weaker entries in the series thanks to control issues and a few other factors. Then there's some multiplayer spin-offs, and finally, Minish Cap, which I also haven't played, though I really want to and really need to because I've heard it's amazing and it's probably just what I've been missing to get a proper traditional Zelda fix. So that's it for the existing 2D Zelda games. It's really not a lot, and considering the appeal they have, I think it's safe to say that the world could really use more. But wait! I actually missed a couple. These two 2D Zelda games just so happen to be games that I absolutely love. Games that are exactly what I crave from Zelda, and what makes me wish for more. These two games being The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds and Cadence of Hyrule. Now, these games still aren't exactly what I would call traditional Zelda. A Link Between Worlds is kinda a reimagining of A Link to the Past, and it also barely utilizes the usual item-based progression system, instead having a shop where you can rent and buy items from. Cadence of Hyrule does have item-based progression, but it's also an indie-based spin-off that, alongside being a Zelda game, is also a rhythm game and a roguelike. But even with their differences to the main formula, they're still amazing and fantastic. But they're not fantastic because of their differences to the formula either. They're fantastic because of how well made they are as games. Additionally, they have one great quality that I mentioned wanting earlier, which could make so much difference. These games aren't full open world, but they are non-linear. Link Between Worlds and Cadence of Hyrule have themselves a balance between the full open world Zelda style and the classic linear Zelda style. They're linear when they need to be for progression and story purposes, and non-linear when there isn't any good reason for them not to be. Obviously, not everyone was a fan of the shop mechanic in Link Between Worlds, which was one of the things that allowed them to do the whole non-linear thing. But there are still parts in A Link Between Worlds that you have to obtain items the traditional way. And Cadence of Hyrule also has a good amount of mandatory items that you need to collect the traditional way, despite also being completely non-linear. And obviously, Zelda games like this don't need to have randomly generated worlds or rhythm mechanics like Cadence of Hyrule did. I feel like that should go without saying. So to summarize, modern 2D Zelda could revive the classic Zelda formula, while also allowing a certain amount of non-linearity that didn't exist before, but not to the point where it infringes on story or progression. And also making classic Zelda far more playable, accessible, and modernized than ever before. All while padding out Zelda's release schedule a lot since the big 3D ones take so damn long to make. And also just allowing us to enjoy some great, tightly designed 2D Zelda fun. Plus, it makes bank for Nintendo, and grows their franchise without having to be that big of an investment due to the smaller scale of 2D Zelda. But there's still one problem in all this, and that problem is, who would make these theoretical 2D Zelda games? The Zelda team is clearly busy with making the big open world Zelda games, and the other teams at Nintendo EPD have other games to work on for other franchises, meaning Nintendo would probably have to outsource 2D Zelda to someone else. The Oracle games and Minish Cap were made by Capcom, so maybe Nintendo could reignite that partnership? I doubt it. Then they could also get Brace Yourself Games, the team behind Cadence of Hyrule, to make a full-on mainline 2D entry. Though, Brace Yourself Games is doing their own projects at the moment, and also while a spin-off is one thing, I doubt Nintendo would outsource a full new mainline entry in a series like Zelda to an indie developer, even though it would probably turn out amazing. So then who on earth could possibly make this amazing new 2D Zelda game we all crave? Wait, who made this again? Enter Grezzo, the team behind not only the Link's Awakening remake, but also the 3DS remasters of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. They also co-developed Triforce Heroes with Nintendo's internal studios. The remake of Link's Awakening was almost exactly 4 years ago, which is how long I'd estimate making a new 2D Zelda game would take. Since then, the only games they've turned out were a port of Miitopia from 3DS, and a game for the Apple Store named Jet Dragon. Now, to be fair, Jet Dragon does look like it would take at least a decent amount of development time, but it's still basically a phone game. Grezzo has done multiple projects at once before, having ported Luigi's Mansion to the 3DS only a year before the Link's Awakening remake was released, and having launched Ever Oasis only a little over 2 years before the Link's Awakening was released. They have over 80 staff members, and since 2D games are way easier to make than 3D ones, that could mean that they'd be able to spare some staff for these other much smaller projects. Especially considering how making Zelda games would rake in much more money for Grezzo than any of these other projects. Like, come on. New 2D Zelda game versus Miitopia, it's a no-brainer. 2D Zelda's gonna do better. So because of this, I find it extremely likely that they're already working on a new 2D Zelda game, and that it's very close to completion. Now, that would beg the question on where this supposed 2D Zelda game is. Like I said, it's been 4 years, which is around how long I guess it would take them to make a new 2D Zelda, and we've still heard nothing. And that brings us around to the elusive Nintendo Switch successor. Everything seems to point to a new Nintendo system launching in holiday 2024. And Nintendo probably has a lot of games slated to release on it, which they can't show until the system itself has been showcased. Then, keep in mind that with Tears of the Kingdom having released so recently, it may be a very, very long time until we can get a new big 3D Zelda game on the Switch too. 2028 at the earliest, with 2029 being much more likely. But what will everyone do with this new system if it won't have an awesome new 3D Zelda game on it for so many years? Easy. They fulfilled that Zelda craving with an awesome new 2D Zelda game. If they have the next 2D Zelda game slated for the first year of the Switch 2's life, then, well, It may disappoint some people that their awesome next-gen Zelda game is a smaller 2D one instead of a larger-scale 3D Zelda game that would show off the hardware power to its fullest potential. But with the next 3D Zelda game so far away, this 2D Zelda solution would be far better than nothing. Besides, Metroid Prime 4 and whatever the new 3D Mario they launch with would probably be more than enough to showcase just how graphically powerful the Switch 2 would be. Plus, just because the game is a 2.5D top-down game doesn't mean it can't have awesome and impressive graphics. I may have been calling it 2D Zelda this whole time, but we all know that the kind of 2D Zelda I'm talking about isn't really 2D at all. It's very much 3D, it just has a top-down camera and a 2D style of gameplay. But the aspect on how it's technically 3D could let it do great stuff visually. Regardless, at the end of the day, regardless of graphical showcasing, an awesome new 2D Zelda game is an awesome new 2D Zelda game. And once they got past their disappointment that it wasn't 3D, a new 2D Zelda game could be a great, fun new release for early adopters of the Switch 2. So that's what I think about 2D Zelda. It's why I think we should get more, why I want it so bad despite struggling to enjoy Zelda games in the past, and why I think it'll be likely that we'll be seeing its grand return soon. A new amazing 2D Zelda game may very well be upon us. All we have left to do is hope. It's possible that we could get remakes of the Oracle games instead, but since the Oracle games just came out on NSO a few months ago, I find that possibility has suddenly become very unlikely. But even if it is just Oracle remakes, that wouldn't be too bad, right? Being able to see those games with 3D visuals on modern hardware would make them so much more playable. I mean, they were released in 2001. Design standards got pretty decent by then. Really, the one real part of their age that was holding back the Oracle games was the Game Boy Color visuals. If they were to be remade for the Switch or the Switch 2, those games would be pretty damn sweet. I still think we'd all prefer a brand new 2D Zelda game, though. So, anyways, if you excuse me, I'm going to go see if I can possibly try and finally finish the Link's Awakening remake. 4 years is a pretty average amount of time to beat that game, right? Right. See ya.